Thank you, everybody, for being here. We're really excited about today's webinar entitled Exploring the State of Sustainability in Higher Education. I'm your moderator, Jay Perlman. We're actually humbled by the attendance here today. We actually have a record 365 registrations for today from an international audience ranging from Florida to Canada and even to many of the islands. So welcome, and we're very excited. I'd like to start by introducing today's speakers. On my left is Jim Cadenas, a senior advisor from Sightlines. Jim's been with us for approximately 10 years and has a broad array of experience in higher ed facilities. On my right is Jennifer Andrews. Jennifer Andrews is the project director at the University of New Hampshire's Sustainability Institute. She's formerly from Clean Air, Cool Planet, which is a name that you all might recognize. Wanted to start again by going over the agenda real quick. We're going to start with an introduction, talk about how we got here and why we conducted this study. We're going to flow into a detailed discussion of the findings, talk about factors that are affecting energy consumption and emissions within higher education today. We're going to talk about which campuses are heading ahead and why, and finally talk about some conclusions and recommendations that we have. As we go through this, we definitely want this to be interactive, so feel free to ask us anything that you might want as we go along. As the slide recommends, there's a box on the bottom of the control panel, which is probably on the right side of your screen right now, where you can type directly to us. And I'll be interjecting along the way, and then probably holding a few for after the slides as well. Also wanted to mention that everybody here will be receiving an email with all of these slides and access to the webinar recording for your future reference. The content today is based upon a paper, a white paper that I commonly refer to as the green paper, which is currently available on our website and actually has the same title as the webinar today. It's available for download for free, so we absolutely encourage all of you to go ahead and grab that. And with that, we're going to start with an introduction, and I'm going to throw it over to Jen.
Thanks, Jay, and again, thank you all for joining us today. We're looking forward to this discussion, which has been really a number of years in the making, and has been really an incredible kind of group effort. The story starts, from my perspective at least, back in 2001. You may remember 2001 was a couple years after the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated internationally, which was an agreement that committed countries to greenhouse gas reductions in an attempt to address climate change, which wasn't ratified by the U.S. Senate. And at UNH in 2001, there were faculty members and new sustainability office staff who were sort of thinking about how to raise awareness and teach about this. And as kind of a thought experiment, wanted to think about what would it mean for the University of New Hampshire to meet Kyoto reduction targets. And in order to do that, of course, they needed to figure out what the climate footprint of the university was. And so no real tool existed for doing that at the time. So they worked on a methodology based on the IPCC guidelines for countries, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's guidelines for countries, and put together a methodology in a spreadsheet that they could then use for 2 years to kind of update the carbon footprint of the campus. Now, having done that, went ahead and shared that methodology with about a dozen schools in the Northeast, working with Clean Air, Cool Planet, which was a nonprofit that worked with colleges and universities as well as businesses and nonprofits to address climate change. And as a result of that, the tool and the spreadsheet were improved upon and updated and revised. And so in 2004 we put it on our website thinking, hey, maybe other folks would benefit from this. And rather accidentally ended up running a program because it ended up that a lot of schools wanted to manage and track their carbon footprints. This is, of course, just before the launch of ACUPCC and before the launch of the the Second Nature Climate Commitment, formerly the ACUPCC. But you know, there was a lot of activity in the higher ed space already at that point around climate change and energy, and folks were starting to pay attention to this. And so over the years, I've had the pleasure of working with many of you on tracking your emissions and your energy, and on climate action planning and thinking about how to move forward. And in, boy, I don't know, 2008, 2009, started talking with Sightlines, who was looking at how they could help campuses do this stuff as part of the work that they offered, and started sort of daydreaming about what an amazing resource it would be if all of that data that was on individual spreadsheets was in an aggregated database, and we could all kind of understand how we were doing, not just individually but collectively, and learn from each other. And from that, we worked together with Sightlines to develop Carbon Map, the carbon management analysis platform, an online version of the calculator. And so we had always planned on using that data to do this sort of analysis at some point. And so that's one sort of kind of framing story or bit of context. The other framing bit of context that I want to hit before we go into the findings is this. This may be very familiar to many of you. It was in a number of kind of overview documents, an offset report that Clean Air Cool Planet put out, a climate action planning guide that ACUPCC created. And really, it has represented what I think the consensus around kind of best practices in energy management and carbon management were in the industry, which is to say you started by the most cost-effective route in terms of, you know, energy being the energy you didn't use. And so the idea was first to conserve and to avoid activities that produced emissions, and then to reduce your footprint by being more efficient in your operations, and then to look at fuel switching. And finally, once you sort of hit all of those other avenues, to offset what you could not avoid, reduce, or replace. And so that has been the conventional wisdom, you know, from early on to now, and sort of what we were going into, or at least what I was going into this report with in the back of my head. And I want to come back to this when we get to the findings. But so that's the other kind of bit of framing. So the point of this was to just try to understand, with all of the energy and investment and commitment and dialogue and hard work that we've all put in over the last, you know, decade plus, and especially with the high-profile launch of the climate commitment back in 2007 and ACUPCC the year before that, how are we actually doing? Are we succeeding in our efforts to manage our emissions through conservation, efficiency, and fuel switching? So those were the initial questions, and then as we sort of dug into the data, other questions quickly emerged. Questions around, okay, so what is driving these numbers? How have changes in enrollment and campus building impacted our efforts? How much does progress depend on the amount and type of investment you have to spend your way to carbon neutrality? How much control do you have, or another way to say that is how much impact do external factors have? And how, you know, finally, of course, what does all this tell us about how we can be more strategic and effective in managing our footprint? So that was the point of the report. In the course of doing the report, we began to look at one other important question, and that's something I want to talk about at the end of the hour too, and that is, what do we have available to us in the current data set? How strong is it? How useful is it? And what's missing? And what can we do to improve it moving forward? So that was how we did the study. I want to talk very briefly about why. I'm sorry, that was why we did the study. I want to talk very briefly about how. So we, especially because this is the first time around, and because we wanted a very consistent, reliable, validated source of data, we looked at the Sightlines Return on Physical Assets database, the ROPA database, which is data that they gather every year and validate every year for their clients. And then, so we took that database and overlaid the campus carbon calculator and carbon map methodology instead of starting with the campus carbon calculator data, because the Sightlines data has extensive QA/QC. And so the numbers that you're going to see today are based on a look at, analytics around that data, and you can see, looking at the map and the sort of graphs over on the right-hand side of the slide, that it's a pretty diverse and representative sample for the U.S. And there are also some Canadian schools in that database as well. So, and one other quick note in terms of methodology, and that is, when we started, I had really fondly hoped to be able to look at all aspects of the carbon footprint that we are that are currently being tracked in the campus carbon calculator and carbon map, and by colleges around the country. So all of Scope 1, all of Scope 2, and the sort of selected Scope 3 sources that are commonly reported. I should back up and say that those scopes come from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the sort of international standard for greenhouse gas reporting, not just for colleges and universities, but for businesses, for government agencies, for entities across the board in countries across the globe. And so they have this sort of framework for setting boundaries and communicating about what it is you're tracking and how you're tracking it. And the framework looks at the sources of your emissions. So Scope 1 sources are from emissions that happen directly on your campus in equipment that you own or control. So that's emissions from your buildings or emissions from your food tables. Scope 2 emissions are, excuse me, emissions from basically utilities. So it's energy that you purchase, but the emissions aren't actually on your campus. Excuse me. And then Scope 3 emissions are either upstream or downstream. And so, please excuse me. Thank you. And so the numbers that we're going to look at today are numbers purely from Scope 1 stationary sources and Scope 2 sources. We're not going to be talking about mobile sources, and we're not going to be talking about Scope 3 sources today. Jim, do you want to, that's kind of the backdrop, so do you want to take us into the detailed findings?
Sure. Thanks, Jen, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone today. So I'm going to start with the stationary Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and consumption. And we looked at data from going back initially to 2010, and then we're going to also look at a data set that goes back as far as 2007. The data set that goes back to 2010 shows about a 5% decrease in emissions and actual increase in consumption. That consumption increase, we think, is primarily due to two factors. One, additional gross square feet that were added, additional buildings that were added to campuses in the data set, and so we just added to our carbon footprint, as well as you can see after a decline down to 2002, the increase from 2002 to 2014 actually reflects increasing fossil consumption because of winter, cooler winters, colder winters, hotter summers, and some factors that are affecting degree days, and so we're seeing some increases as a result of that. When we look at this normalized, that is divided by gross square feet, so metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per 1,000 gross square feet, we see a 13% decrease in emissions, and only about a 2% decrease in consumption. So again, that increase in growth of the campuses, additional square footage, as well as the kind of buildings that were being constructed, more technically complex buildings, using more electricity, potentially even using more fossil fuel, as well as some colder climate, increase in degree days, we are seeing that consumption is lagging emissions, and we'll get into some of the details about that in a minute as to why there's such a difference between those numbers even when we look at it on a square foot basis. Just pulling out fossil particularly, fossil emissions decreased 14%, consumption was down about 4%, from going back to 2007. This data we're able to get all the way back to 2007 for the roughly 350 campuses that are involved here. So you're seeing that, again, emissions greater than consumption. Why? Primarily fuel switching. Jen talked about that as one of the pieces of the hierarchy, and there's been a pretty remarkable change in how people are, in the fuels that people are using. In 2007, 74% of the fossil consumption was natural gas. That went all the way up to 87% by 2013. You can see it's kind of leveled off from 13 to 14. That may be signs that we've kind of wrung this out as far as we can here. And the fuel switching primarily from coal, which was 17-18% back in 2007-8, down to 10%, and other fuels, which were primarily oil, 9% to 3%, although that oil has not changed much, and maybe seeing some signs with the price of oil that, in fact, oil is coming back as a fuel on college campuses. But the big shift here from coal and oil to natural gas is really what's had the big impact, and why, in the previous slide, we show emissions being down 14%, but consumption on a square foot basis only being down 4%. So the fuel switching, part of that hierarchy that Jen talked about, really an important concept and one of the main strategies people have used so far to reduce their emissions. When we look at electricity, we see a little bit more modest kind of change. Going back to 2007, we see electric emissions decreasing about 2%, and consumption actually increasing 1%. Again, we think that's primarily due to more technically complex buildings that have been built in the last few years. These buildings tend to use more electricity, and as a result, they've got more demand, and demand, even on a square foot basis, is actually up with electricity. The electric emissions decline can again be tracked back to our analysis of 21 electric grids, of which 17 out of the 21 actually had decreases in emissions from 2007 to 2014. And so those declines in emissions primarily, again, were shifting from coal as a major source for the electric grid electricity generation to natural gas, a cleaner source of fuel. So we're seeing that these numbers are very similar to what we're seeing on college campuses, very similar to what we're seeing across the electric grid. And one of the questions we asked is how do these numbers compare to other industries? And one of the things we found is when we looked at the overall consumption and emissions, they were pretty similar to what we've seen in other industries. And I know that higher ed would like to be a leader on this and would like to be in front of other industries, but in fact, as we look at EPA numbers for other industries, that overall decline in emissions and increase in aggregate consumption, and more modest when you take a look at it on a normalized basis, the decline of around 13% in emissions and around 2 or 3% in consumption is pretty reflective of what we see in other industries. So higher ed's pretty consistent. Jay, I think we have a question here that maybe we want to answer on some of this initial data.
Sure, Jim. We have a question that would like you to clarify specifically what you mean when you use the word technically complex.
Great question. In the Sightlines database, we have rated every building on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of the technical complexity of the building. That is, air movement, technical systems that are within that building, including electrical systems and technology-based systems that are putting a demand on particularly electricity and maybe putting some demand on the fossil consumption. And so 5 would be a very complex building, a research facility with 100% air movement. A 1 would be a house where you basically open and close windows to move air. So the higher technically complex buildings, and particularly the LEED certified buildings, are in fact more complex to run. They've got big air handlers. They're generating a lot of a high level of electrical usage, and as a result, what we're seeing is an increase in demand for electricity in those buildings.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jim. One other clarification. One viewer was interested in a review of how many schools were included in this study overall?
340, roughly 50 institutions. Those institutions have about 450 campuses. A number of those institutions have multiple campuses. So overall, this represents about 1.5 billion square feet of space, about 50,000 buildings.
Sure. Thank you.
I'm sorry. You also had a couple clarification questions about the normalized versus absolute data, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the date, the discrepancy in date range.
Yeah. In some cases, we didn't have all the details in terms of the actual square footage going back as far for every campus. So what we've done is looked at is where we could. We've been able to normalize this by dividing the metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions by the square footage that we've gotten for the campuses.
And actually, Jim, if you don't mind going back to the here. So the the absolute numbers we have are 2010 to 2014 because that was the most consistent, like you were saying, that's the most consistent data set we had.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's where we had every campus start to finish, and then when we started adding campuses or subtracting campuses, we were able to go back to 2007 and normalize it. So we've only aggregated the data when we've had at least 5 years of data for every campus.
Sure. And Jim, along those lines, somebody has asked whether the data has been weather normalized as well.
We'll get into that. The data has not been weather normalized, but we will actually show you some slides in a few minutes that actually looks at comparisons against degree days and whether or not degree days make a difference in terms of these numbers in different parts of the country.
The other thing, just before we leave this, that I'd love to interject is a little bit of perspective. Those absolute numbers, the 2010 to 2014 numbers, I just, right before this, took a quick look at emissions from the U.S. from stationary energy combustion. So that's what we're talking about here on campuses. And for the same date range, the overall average was a reduction in emissions of over 9%. So comparatively, based on the sample that we have, we're lagging. Yeah.
Good. So let's look at some of the factors that are affecting energy consumption and emissions. One is size. We found that there was a correlation between campus size and energy consumption. So you can see on one axis we've got our total energy consumption in MMBTUs, and the right-hand side total gross square foot. We plotted every campus on the database here and looked at where kind of the trend line is. And you can see, obviously, as campuses get smaller towards the left-hand side of the graph, you can see that the consumption is lower. And as campuses get larger, in the 10 to 15, the larger mega campuses, consumption gets higher. But you can see there are dots in both places where you've got campuses that are down in the 1 to 2 million square foot range, and they're in the 1 to 2 million energy consumption, MMBTUs per square foot. And all the way to the right-hand side, you can see campuses that are in the 10 million square foot range that are also around 2 million MMBTUs. So campus size certainly is a factor here. The bigger you are, the more you tend to consume, the more, you know, even on a square foot basis, because you tend to have bigger, more complex buildings, but not always true. So there were, obviously outliers, and we did take a look at some of those outliers, and in the report there's some examples of campuses done particularly well. Second thing we looked at is space, campus space and enrollment growth trends. And what we did is we used 2007 as the baseline, and so if that's your zero line, and we looked at the percentage of growth in space versus enrollment. This is across all campuses. So obviously some of you are in regions where this is actually a different picture, either better or worse, but nationwide you saw a rapid increase because the pool of high school graduates coming out, sort of a baby boom coming out. They were going into schools and enrolling from 2007 to about 2011, and that line looked like a pretty straight trajectory. And in fact, by 2011, we had seen about an 8% increase in enrollment, and only about half of that an increase in campus space. So campus space was kind of lagging this baby boom that was coming in, a baby boomlet that was coming into college and universities. In 2012, things started leveling off, and by 2014, we've actually seen this growth curve on enrollment kind kind of actually drop off a little bit, yet the enrollment, the space growth is now up to about 10%. So people have either continued to build, or we think partly what's happened is that there was a lag in building. That is, people thought that the enrollment was going to continue to rise, and as a result, they added square footage, but it takes a couple of years to build a building. You can't build a building in 6 months, and especially a large, technically complex building, LEED certified building, you're going to see it might take as long as 2 years to build that building. And so when you started in 2012 thinking enrollment was going to continue, and it gets in place in 2014 as that lag. Secondly, a lot of the buildings that were built during this period of time also replaced or renovated and expanded existing buildings. And so there was some additional space because you had a lot of deferred maintenance, as we've documented in our State of Higher Ed Facilities report. And what we're seeing is campuses either replacing buildings that are in poor condition that were built in the 60s and 70s, or renovating them, putting additions on them with newer, more modern facilities. And so as a result, we're continuing to see that enrollment, that space growth now outpacing enrollment growth, particularly true in the Northeast, the Midwest, a little less true in the South and the West. But overall, what we are seeing here is that we've got a case where the campus footprint is actually getting bigger, and that helps explain some of these gross numbers that we're seeing on college campuses for admissions and consumption. We did look at breaking it down public versus private, and what's interesting is that the public institutions had a better record here. They were down about 5% in terms of overall consumption, and private campuses were down just not quite 2%. So we think some of this was driven by public policy. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But we do think that some public institutions were under mandates to reduce consumption and reduce admissions, and we're seeing some impact of that as a result of these numbers. We also wanted to look at where capital dollars were spent. One of our theories was that if you put capital money into a building and replace old, worn-out HVAC systems that were built in the 60s and 70s when energy costs were very, very low, that these buildings, that in fact you'd see improvement. And so we looked at where dollars went in terms of 3 different categories: space renewal and safety code, so how much was spent on the actual renovation of actual space, changing the painting, carpeting, changing the walls, configuration of the building. Envelope and building systems, that is the roofs, the exteriors, the windows, the doors, and HVAC, electrical and plumbing systems. And then campus infrastructure, which primarily in this case were utility infrastructure, better utility systems. You can see that if you take a look from 2007 to 2014, public universities had 44% of their money going to space renewal in 2007. By 2014, that was down to 36%, and their growth was in both the envelope and building systems, and particularly in the infrastructure. And so public universities, I think, again, driven by some of this public policy and maybe being part of a system that had certain requirements, saw a shift in terms of where they spent their money. Private institutions, not so much. Space was 43% back in 2007, 45% in 2014. The envelope and building systems about the same, the infrastructure about the same. One difference we see is that private campuses spend about on our database, about $3 more per square foot than public campuses. And so there's more money in private campuses and maybe less pressure to kind of move money from the space and renovating space into systems and envelope and mechanical needs and infrastructure needs that might have a greater impact on energy. But overall, we think that public institutions, one of the reasons why their numbers are a little bit better is because there's been some change in philosophy with limited dollars to say we're going to put more into the HVAC and the electrical systems and the utility infrastructure that's going to have a big impact on both consumption and emission. We did look at different types of institutions. We don't want you to think that this is a monolith out there. That is that, because these numbers in aggregate appear to us to at least be somewhat disappointing from where we thought we could be, we did find that different campuses we found, for example, almost 70 institutions that reduced more than 10%. And we found a number of institutions that were between 80 and 100 or so that had about the same kind of consumption over the period that we looked at. And then we found some that actually increased their consumption by more than 10%. So you can see, and we did look at and do some studying of those campuses that reduced by more than 10%, and we found that they had a much more systematic approach. They spent more of their capital dollars on infrastructure and on envelope and mechanical systems, and they often were in states where there was big public policy incentives for them to consume less and actually implement some energy conservation programs. One of the questions we got, Jay, was about the degree days and the difference between degree days, and we mapped here both degree days and unit cost and consumption, because we wanted to see, well, do costs make a difference and degree days make a difference? And so on the bars here, you're seeing purchase fossil and purchase electric, and we've grouped this by 6 regions across the U.S. and Canada. And then what we did is also map fossil unit costs and electric costs. So you can see that there's big difference in electric costs. Obviously, in the far west and New England and the mid-east, electric costs are very high, and also fossil costs are higher than they are in the other regions. But what's really interesting is the difference in consumption. You can see that if we just compare New England to the Great Lakes, the degree days in New England are just slightly more, a couple hundred degree days per year, than in the Midwest and the Great Lakes area. But you can see that the costs are significantly higher, and consumption is about 50% lower in New England than it is in the Great Lakes region. And so Plains, Southeast, Great Lakes, the higher consuming areas tend to be lower cost areas, and degree days don't seem to be as big an issue here. Costs seem to trump degree days. Degree days obviously are a factor in consuming more, but when we compare the Great Lakes to New England, it's very similar in degree days, very different in cost, and as a result, you're seeing behavior change in terms of consumption overall. We can see the same picture for emissions when we tracked emissions, and in fact, it's even a little bit more dramatic when you compare New England to the Great Lakes area. New England has the lowest emissions. Partly that's also, they have very clean grids too, so the electric grids are cleaner. The Great Lakes area tends to have not such clean electric grids, but also are more coal-oriented in terms of their plants, and so as a result, you're seeing multiples in terms of emissions for the Great Lakes compared to New England. I'm going to turn back to Jen and let her talk for a few minutes about state policy, but before that, I think Jay's got a couple more questions.
Sure. Jim, it was asked about a couple slides back, you had mentioned that more technically complex, newer facilities consume more energy than older ones. Can you elaborate on that? Because the common convention is that newer spaces are constructed to a higher energy conservation standard.
Yeah, and I think that's probably, I think that's likely to be true, but they tend to have, the more complex systems tend to be higher generators of electricity overall. Now, maybe on a square foot basis, they're going to be more efficient than the older energy hog kind of buildings. So when we look at BTUs per gross square foot, we might find a better number for that for those types of buildings. But those buildings do add to your carbon footprint because they are complicated buildings and they are costly to run. And we're finding they have, in many cases, people underestimated the cost of running those utility systems. They were told it was going to be a lot cheaper to do this, but it ended up maybe not being as cheap as they thought because of huge air handlers that had to be run 24 hours a day and that sort of thing. Jen, you want to comment on that?
Well, I was just thinking, sort of anecdotally, because one of the fun things about this is that I get to wear my kind of data overview hat from my work with the calculator, but I also get to wear my on-campus operational hat because I'm the person at UNH who coordinates our energy task force. So I was just thinking about how we have the same problem where we have these buildings that are more efficient, tighter, more preferable in many ways, but every time we renovate, we're adding air conditioning to a space that didn't used to have air conditioning. We're adding air exchange to a space that didn't have as much air exchange. So many of the individual systems are more efficient, but the building overall ends up
Yeah, I think it's a question of aggregate versus gross versus net. You know, certainly we've added more space and we've added more technically complex space, and so our gross numbers are higher than our net numbers when we start looking at a square foot basis. So I think we've got both ways, and we've tried to capture both of those aspects in this data set.
So basically, it's that we largely don't experience in-kind replacement with facilities. We tend to replace things like, 50-year-old steam-driven facilities with no air conditioning, with more complex facilities with air handlers and extensive air flow within the building that uses more energy.
And larger. In many cases, the renovations has resulted in additional square footage. That is, they added on to the old science building an additional set of square footage to accommodate new science labs and modern ways of doing science and engineering, for example.
Excellent. And also one clarification on slides number 25 and 26 when we're looking at the energy consumption by region. Can we just clarify what year that is?
This was in 2014. So we looked the latest year of this just to look at degree days in this particular year and consumption in that year. So that was the latest year we have full data set for, 2014. Fiscal year 2014. So it would have ended June 30th, 2014.
Great. Thanks, Jim.
Okay, I think we're ready to go on to taking a look at some policy factors here, and I'm going to turn it back to Jen.
Thanks. And I apologize for my coughing fit earlier. I have a little bit of a cold, so bear with me. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. So Jim, you gestured to this really in the previous couple of slides, but we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into okay, what's driving some of those cost factors, and how much do state policies come into play or not come into play. And so we looked at the American Council for Energy Efficiency rankings of state energy policies and how strong they are in terms of providing incentives, rebates or credits or matching programs for folks around energy efficient technology. And they annually rank states according to the strength of those policies. And so you see the results of those rankings on this map. When we then sort of looked at the states in which the schools in the database were, we saw that the schools that were in states that ranked in the top third for energy efficiency policies had emissions that were 27% lower than those in the middle third and 72% lower than those in the top third. So the takeaway from this is perhaps intuitive, but it was really amazing to see it in the numbers, the amount of difference strong energy efficiency policies make on emissions. And I'm still puzzling a little over this because if we look at the next slide, we looked at the previous, whoops, no, that's fine, the previous one. So this is emissions. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we were there before. So this is emissions and policy. And then the next slide is policy and consumption. Now this is rankings on efficiency policy, and we see that the efficiency policies seem to have an even stronger correlation with low emissions than they do with lower consumption. Now that may very well be that states with strong energy efficiency policies also have strong renewable policies, and or in parts of the country where they have more hydro or nuclear or that sort of thing. But at any rate, it's clear that strong energy policies in a state do correlate very strongly with stronger performance in terms of both emissions and energy consumption. And again, that's not, policy is not fate. There are certainly examples that run counter to that, but that was definitely a trend that we found. So one other factor in terms of making progress that we also looked at was the role of institutional commitment, and for that the sort of indicator that we used was the schools that had signed on to the what was formerly the American College and University President's Climate Commitment, now the Second Nature Carbon Commitment. And so we looked at schools that had signed on to that and compared emissions of those schools with the schools in the database that had not made that commitment. And found, again, this was for 2014, that in terms of both emissions and energy consumption, that there is a significant difference or a significant correlation between a commitment and stronger performance. We also looked at that over time. So the previous slide was just the most recent year for which we had data, 2014. But we wanted to sort of see what did this look like from the get-go, so to speak, and then kind of how did it change. Understanding that, you know, these are long-term commitments that schools are making, that, as Jim said, things like construction or investing in new systems or integrating commitments into your long-term plans, these take time. But at any rate, looking at the data over time, what we've seen is that it looks like, you know, there was a year or two kind of ramping up, and then progress in terms of reducing energy consumption. But then the progress sort of, you know, kind of goes in fits and starts or waxes and wanes, but it's not linear, and that it is hard to sustain. And I think a lot of that does come back to the kind of building boom that Jim was talking about earlier. That certainly seems to have been a driving factor, and economics and weather, you know, all of these things factor into it. But ultimately, the data just sort of demonstrates something else, which again may be rather intuitive, which is this stuff is difficult and requires continued attention and investment.
Great, thanks, Jen. We had another inquiry from the audience, specifically on slide number 29, where we grouped the states into thirds. The question was, how many of the states within the top third have aggressive strategies such as cap and trade or carbon taxes? Okay, so let's go back to the math for a minute. So the top third would be the, like the top numbers 1 through 18, something like that. So you can see most of them are in the upper Midwest, or I'm sorry, in the Northeast rather. So sort of RGGI territory, and or off on the west coast there, California, Oregon, Washington, where they have some state agreements, and obviously California has cap and trade. And then in the kind of Midwest, where they also have sort of regional dialogue and conversations, although they don't have, you know, it's not RGGI and it's not cap and trade. So yeah, so hopefully looking at the map helps to answer that. There definitely, again, is a strong correlation there. Great, thank you.
So let me kind of wrap this up and then we'll get into some of the questions that we've been receiving. And thank you very much for sending all of your questions, and they've been very active. It's popping up on the screen continuously as we've been going through. So what are some of the key takeaways from our analysis? And of course, obviously, the report's got a lot more detail in it, but certainly the gross emissions are down in a modest way, about 5%. Consumption slightly up. That's not quite as good as we've seen from some of the EPA numbers, although similar to some other large industries. Emissions better when we start looking on normalized basis. So we're able to go back to 2007, down about 13%, but usage down only about 2%. Progress primarily came in the emissions area as a result of fuel switching, of that big shift that we saw to natural gas from coal and other fuels, particularly oil, and kind of keeping a monitoring on that, whether that's going to be sustained given some of the shifts in prices of oil in particular. Campuses have done some shifting in their investments. I don't think there's any question that we're seeing some movement more towards envelope and mechanical and utility systems, and those campuses are making more progress in reducing emissions and reducing overall usage, just getting more efficient systems in place, and they're fixing some of the older buildings. I think one of the things that we've been seeing over the years is that you've got a lot of deferred maintenance in these old 60s and 70s buildings, and they're just not running very well, and so replacing those envelope and mechanical systems are going to make a big difference. We did find that when we looked at a subset of schools that actually had stable consumption, a lot of them were spending actually more money on envelope and mechanical systems just to keep their consumption stable. So if you roll to your physical plant, you're probably going to have to wheel more money around to that envelope and mechanical systems to just, you know, keep going in terms of where you want to go and in terms of your emissions and consumption goals.
running in place.
You know, campus size, density, age profile, capital investment are drivers. There's no question. We've been able to look at those factors. Institutional commitment, the signing of the climate commitment, we found consistently, and we looked at examples. Some of the examples we cited in the paper do show that where there's strong campus leadership seems to pay off. It seems to be a driver in sustainability outcomes. Energy cost has a big impact on consumption. Where things are less costly, there tends to be less incentive, less return on investment to be able to make those investments to reduce energy consumption, put in the capital dollars, and in many of those states, there's also less public policy incentives. There's less, you know, matching and those types of incentive programs, discounting kind of programs that affect energy use. And public policy incentives are important. And so we're going to get, I think, ready to go answer some of the questions, Jay, in terms of get a chance to get the audience ask us more details about strategy and about the data.
Great, thanks, Jim. So I interrupted you along the way with a lot of the more specific granular items about particular slides. I've held a lot of the strategic kind of overarching broad inquiries for now. And a couple of these we've already spoken about, but wanted to get some of your kind of anecdotal input into these. In particular, it was asked, in general, in your experience, Jen, how important is institutional commitment from leadership at institutions as we try to drive outcomes?
Right. Well, I mean, you know, the data certainly demonstrated a strong correlation, and that's not to say that, well, two things. That's not to say that the only way to demonstrate institutional commitment is to sign on to any particular program, but we really did see that that the carbon commitment, formerly the PCC, drove an incredible amount of kind of conversation and thinking and the dialogue, which I think has had a lot of payoff along the way, and also introduced an amount and a degree of sort of accountability, continued reporting, which has been absolutely invaluable. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, you know, Jim, you mentioned with, you know, oil prices and kind of coming to the end of perhaps the road in terms of switching to natural gas, which, you know, the price was a big driver and that for a while. And so I've been thinking a lot about how the institutional commitment top down, but also from the folks who are doing the stuff day in and that day out in facilities and campus planning and energy management and on the kind of operational side, that it's more important than ever now, because it's going to be really easy to take the path of least resistance or the kind of more sort of straightforward, lower first cost path. And I think one of the kind of key elements of leadership and commitment moving forward will be a real commitment to looking at life cycle costing and long-term trends and not sort of jumping on whatever is kind of cheapest at the moment. And, you know, I mean, there's a reason for doing that. I mean, there are real cost imperatives. And so it's going to take an incredible amount of creativity, I think, and commitment, not just in principle, but a sense that this really is an opportunity for campuses, not just to lead from a moral perspective, but to innovate.
I think one of the things we found when we looked at individual campuses was sustainability became a priority for a number of different levels. The board, the president, the chief business officer, financial officer got on board with this and understood this, facilities, sustainability, faculty, students. So there was a lot of leadership opportunities all through the institution, not just one or two people that were, you know, just at the Office of Sustainability pushing this. And so we found that, you know, these issues were infused in lots of decisions that were being made at lots of levels. And we're very, very encouraged, for example, to see such a push by NACUBO on business officers to try to get more information in front of business officers on sustainability issues and investment and how it affects sustainability. I think they're doing a great job in terms of making much greater awareness among a group that probably is pretty tough in terms of wanting to see the bottom line ROI investment.
Well, and one of the things I'm most excited about that's kind of come up in discussion at UNH is talk about investments and the opportunity to sort of more closely align the interests of employees, for example, who have retirement accounts that they're investing, or alumni, or students, and give them a chance to invest directly in the campus that they work on, that they study on, that they care about. And so maybe they get a slightly lower return than they would in the market, but they're seeing some tangible results. And so that seems like an incredible win-win, for example. It's all about leadership and thinking differently.
Excellent. I'm going to ask a follow-up to this, which actually just came in. Seems like the right place to ask it, which is, how much is the climate commitment and other agreements sort of a cause and effect relationship? Can you specifically say, or in your experience, is an institution signing on to a commitment, is that signing what's driving results, or are institutions that are more likely to be successful tend to sign those commitments?
I'm sure. I mean, I think it's pretty nuanced, right? I mean, I think most institutions aren't going to sign something that they think they can't achieve. On the other hand, having made that commitment does provide an enhanced level of accountability and visibility, and it kind of makes it a lot harder to push something to the back burner when other more pressing or urgent things come up. So, I would not say yes or no absolutely either way, but I think it is nuanced. But I think there's an important role for those sorts of commitments. Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. I'm going to jump to the next one. It's probably right up Jim's alley. It's essentially, what role does strategic capital investment play in reducing carbon emissions, and how do we turn some of our facilities challenges into successes on the green side? There's a follow-up to that that just arrived, which is if you can elaborate on the effect of really solid plan maintenance initiatives and how that kind of rolls into the same theme.
Good questions in terms of, I think this is pivotal if we're going to, in the long run, be sustainable in terms of emissions, but also financially. I think their capital plan has to go hand in hand with these sustainability initiatives. And I think, I focus on three areas. One is new space. I think one of the questions here is, adding to your footprint is in fact adding buildings, adding square footage adds to your carbon footprint. And I know a lot of campuses have big expansions. Some campuses we're seeing, like University of Illinois, Rutgers, Ohio State, beginning to think more about kind of a no net new growth. It doesn't mean that they're not going to build new buildings. They're just going to knock something down that was not as efficient for them and not as strategic for them to have in their facilities. And so I think, having strong policies on growth and understanding where you're going to be going and how you can do growth more strategically is important. Second, fixing some of the buildings that are driving these energy numbers up. I mean, we know that we've got huge amounts of deferred maintenance. It's growing at a rate of 5-6% a year. It's primarily because all of the 1960s and 70s buildings are now turning 50 years old. They need major overhauls and replacement of their HVAC systems. They need new electrical systems, and that will make a difference. Deciding priorities in terms of renovating those buildings and putting in more efficient systems is going to be important. And then I think the third, going to the question that just came in, is the ongoing plan and preventive maintenance. We know that when you maintain these systems and keep them running efficiently, particularly these new higher tech systems, it's going to make them last longer. We're going to extend life cycles, and we're not going to run into high costs. So I know that we've met a number of campuses that put in very technically complex systems with very heavy amounts of air movement, big motors in the buildings. They were not able to, they didn't maintain them properly, and in 10 to 15 years they've had to replace them. And so those motors should be lasting a lot longer than that, and as a result, but you've got to have that PM, that planned maintenance, and I think we found the more technically complex buildings require more planned and preventive maintenance. So I think all three of those strategies, the new growth, the dealing with the backlog of deferred maintenance and being more proactive on preventive maintenance are all going to have big payoffs on the sustainability side.
Great.
Can I just ask, I mean, on that point, the discussion, at least in our Energy Task Force, is always, yes, absolutely, we want to do that, but we don't have money to do all of the maintenance that we would like to do or is ideal. What has been the most, like, what do you say to boards? Well,
I think the question is really the payoff on this. We did a study for the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. There are 14 campuses. They have had over the last half dozen years or so a 65% increase in planned and preventive maintenance. Their total work orders are down 25%. So as a result, they're doing lower cost preventive work orders, but the total amount of work orders that they're getting, those calls that people are calling in and saying, come fix this, have actually down 25%. And so I think there's a clear relationship between doing cheaper, more preventive approaches versus those reactive maintenance, which might cost you 2 or 3 times more, and you can actually avoid. There's a lot of cost avoidance going on with those, and I think that's the point you want to make, is that give us an opportunity to do more PM.
Mm.
Great. The next question I'm going to put out to Jen, and I'm going to add another question that we just received. But essentially, it was asked, what opportunities exist to implement renewable energy strategies, and what could help drive large-scale adoption of renewables across higher ed. And I'd like to add on to that a question of policies regarding offsets. How well adopted are offsets? How are they being viewed by institutions? And what sort of acceptance are they having within the marketplace?
Okay, so that's like 20 questions.
It's a little bit of a loaded question.
Right. So the first thing, to be clear, one thing we were not, that the data does not include here is a specific look at either on-site renewable installations or REC purchases, that sort of thing. This is purely looking at, fossil energy and electricity purchases. And so one of the things that we really want to be able to do is to dig more into the renewable energy RECs and offsets piece. And I'm actually working with a group of folks now to get that study moving. Because it really did come through to me so clearly. Like, this is the first thing that stuck out is I'm thinking the progress we're going to be making on emissions reductions is around the avoidance and efficiency, but it's almost all around fuel switching, right? So to me that says maybe we need to really be thinking about fuel switching as the way to go. And one of the things I'm most excited, now there's some caveats to that, and I think Jim's question about, well, how much further, especially natural gas, can we go? But one of the things I'm most excited about is this Green Gigawatt partnership that was announced at the ACUPCC conference last fall, that ACUPCC is partnering with Altenex to do, which really is a way of, it's looking at power purchase agreements, large-scale power purchase agreements, and the opportunities that those offer campuses to control their costs and make their costs less volatile, not have to invest in infrastructure that requires a lot of maintenance, not have to have so many sort of permitting or other headaches or learning curves, but have the benefit of renewable energy and investing in the renewable energy system in a pretty kind of turnkey way and in a way that helps kind of move the market forward. So I'm pretty excited about power purchase, and I think there's some great examples in the report. We have a couple of examples of schools that have really benefited from that, and everyone's probably heard about the big kind of partnership between American University and George Washington, maybe it was 2 years ago now, and the work that the University of California system is doing on power purchase agreements. So I think there's an awful lot we can do around renewable energy, and that we're really just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the potential. I also think that if we don't do that, then the progress that we've made so far on the back of natural gas is not really progress, because we all know there are a lot of trade-offs in switching to natural gas, and it was very largely economically driven. And if the paradigm is just simply we're switching to the lowest cost fuel, well, now the lowest cost fuel is oil, and tomorrow it might be, coal. So point being that these renewable energy strategies offer stability, cost stability, and predictability if they're sort of contracted right. There's an incredible number of new sort of financing options or financial options, not just financing, ways to pay for them. And we haven't really touched on the fact, but and they potentially offer advantages in terms of resilience, climate adaptation, and energy security on campus to the extent they're distributed and potentially paired with batteries down the road.
Great. We're just about up against the end of our time window here, so I wanted to ask a concluding item for probably each of you, but I also wanted to mention that we do have a lot of questions from the group. We will be responding to each of those offline, so I don't want anybody out there to feel as if we skipped their particular item. We will be responding relatively quickly. But the question that I wanted to ask you both is, do the current tools and platforms for collecting and reporting out these metrics, completely support the movement and the progress that's been made, and are there opportunities to improve that over time?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question because there's a ton of opportunities to improve it, and I am excited about the work that's going on in the space around data and metrics and the conversations, and I'm excited about what we have on our sort of radar in the short term around those things in terms of improvements to Carbon Map and analytics. But one of the things that we've begun to talk with partners like Sightlines about, like ACUPCC and Second Nature and Kubo and Sustainable Endowments and a number of others, is developing a consortium of campuses and nonprofits and government agencies to really focus on this question of how we support more informed, data-driven decision-making and investment through development of improved platforms and tools. And so maybe that means working together on ultimately developing one very streamlined, very interconnected platform of all of these different tools. Maybe it means developing more consistent sort of taxonomies, or maybe it means working together more on these sorts of analyses. But I think that there's a ton of opportunity, and the partners that we've been talking to have been just incredibly supportive and collaborative around that idea. And so if anyone is interested in that or has questions, I'd love to talk more with them about it. But that's something I'm really excited about, that we actually had planned a meeting last Friday in DC to talk about it, and then the blizzard came, and that meeting did not happen, but I'm looking forward to doing it again.
Well, I think also we've gone as far as we could go with the core metrics here that we've created here, the Scope 1 and Scope 2. There's a lot more work to be done on Scope 3 and trying to capture that, as well as some of the offsets and renewables and other aspects of this that would make this a richer, more comprehensive analysis. So this is our attempt to really get the data out for the first time on a national level, and actually an international level, begin to look at the trends and really look at kind of answering the question how we're doing. I think to be able to get that answer done more comprehensively, we're going to have to expand this data set and expand the number of institutions that we have data for.
And do a better job of quality control for it, too. I mean, we were really lucky to have the ROPA database to draw from because of the quality control. I would love to be able to use some of the even kind of bigger data sets, like the carbon calculator and carbon map, to do primary analysis in the future. But we all need to sort of get better collectively around our data validation and control and those sorts of things to be able to do that.
Jen, Jim, thank you very much. It's been great. Just want to remind everybody out there that everybody who's been watching today will receive an email. That email will have a copy of the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording for everything that you just heard. In the meantime, if there are any other questions at all, please do not hesitate to email us. Contact information will be available in that email, as well as in the slides if you want to reach out to the speakers directly. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.